A good campaign doesn't start with batching 250 Instagram posts. It starts with clarity around your message and understanding what your end goal is. And when you have that, you don't need to show up constantly in all of the places. You just need a plan. So in the last episode, we looked at what might be missing in your content marketing strategy. And today we are walking through what are the key pieces of an intentional, flexible, results-driven marketing campaign. So let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of the Cozypreneur podcast. If this is your first time listening, Cozypreneur is all about helping you make money and work with the dreamiest of clients. So grab your beverage, get your cozy socks on, and let's dive in. When I first started in the online space, I was taught to do a launch in a very specific way where you are talking about the problems, you are agitating and rubbing salt in the wound, and you're talking about the solution. And you're doing this in pre-launch. And then you're moving into your actual launch campaign where you are promoting your offer constantly for a week or two and showing up on stories and being on Instagram all of the time and making sure that you're in people's inboxes every day. And it's exhausting. It is exhausting to do these big launches, even if you only do a few a year, because putting all of that time and effort into 1 week of sales, it puts a lot of pressure on, and it is really tiring to be on that much. I'm super introverted. If I have a day of showing up a lot, the next day I want to be sitting on my couch in my pajamas and not really talking to people. So doing something like a live launch, a big launch event where I'm constantly showing up, it doesn't work for me. And so I've had to reframe how I think about launching. And so for me, it's really create these mini campaigns. And I use these campaigns to promote my membership. I use it to promote my copy studio services, anything that I'm really working on, right? And it doesn't just have to be selling your offer. You could have a campaign that's about releasing a podcast, or I don't know, depending on your business and your goals, there's a lot of different things that you could do. It could be an engagement campaign, right? So a campaign is just a plan for how to reach your goals. And there are some core pieces of having a strategic campaign. And I'm going to break down exactly what I do for myself, what I recommend for my clients, and what I do for my done for you clients too. So the first thing is starting with your offer and really breaking down what is the big promise. And this is something that is really hard to be hey, here's one sentence about how my brand helps people. But it's also really important because it's what's going to differentiate you, right? And so really thinking about, how does this offer help people? What problem does it solve for them? What is it going to look like when they solve this problem? And what's my approach in this, right? How do I recommend people solving this problem? And starting there, before you create any content, really breaking down the offer, how it helps people, why you even offer this offer in the first place. And then from there, you can really start to think about, how can you position yourself? And you can start to plan out, how are you going to nurture your people, right? How are you going to show them that you know exactly what you're talking about, and you do this in a specific way based on different stories or experiences that you bring to the table. So if you notice, before we think about where we're showing up or how we're showing up, we are thinking about messaging. And if you are somebody who's I need to go deeper into messaging, there are old episodes where I dig into my messaging framework, so you can dive into those, but really thinking about your messaging and not just going into ChatGPT and saying, hey, I need to create messaging for this campaign. Really personalize it, right? What are the stories? What are the reasons that led you to create this offer? What are the gaps that you saw in the market? And how does your offer help fill those gaps? That's really where you have messaging gold, is when you can clearly articulate. Once you have that messaging framework, that is where we can start to create an actual execution plan. So your messaging framework has a big picture story, right? It's kind of telling your people, here's where you are now, and here's why you're stuck there, and this is where you want to be, and here's how my offer helps you get there, and here's how I approach this work, and here's how I approach working with my clients, right? This is why I do what I do. that's your overarching story for your campaign. And so once you know that overarching story, you can start to actually plan, okay, how am I going to show up on my podcast and tell this story? How am I going to show up on social media and tell a story? What about my emails? And also thinking about what are some different lenses that I can tell this overarching story so that, yes, you're repeating yourself, you're telling the same story, but it's not boring because it's every little piece of content might have a little bit of a different perspective, right? So to give an example of this, I usually start with my podcast episodes when I'm planning a campaign. And the reason is because I batch all of my podcast episodes. It is the first piece of content that I do ahead of time, right? So I am recording these September episodes in August. And that's why I start with my podcast episode. It's just a system that works for me. You don't necessarily need to start with, your long form content, but you can. So for me, I start with podcast episodes and then I move into my email marketing calendar. After my podcast episodes are done, I know what I'm selling. I know what the story is. I outline my podcast episodes from there. And then I go into my email marketing calendar and I think about what is the story that I want to tell in email. And of course, it is going to be the same overarching story that I told in my podcasts. But maybe I can go deeper into some ideas or change the lens a little bit here. Or, maybe there's a question that has come up since I recorded these podcast episodes that I really want to address in my emails. So to give an example, this month in August, I know you're listening in September, but in August, I'm selling a brand messaging intensive, right? And so this is an offer that I created recently because while I have my brand project course, I realized there are people in my audience who don't want to take a course. They don't really want to do all of that work. They don't want to do the 10-week timeline, but there are people in my audience who still need the messaging support, but aren't necessarily ready to completely outsource it, right? Maybe they want to write their website. Maybe they want to start working on their email marketing, but they aren't quite ready to outsource completely and they want more support than the membership. And so I created this offer to fill that gap, right? And the way that if you are on the email list, you got to experience this, but I use the story of my own branding. I got my visual branding done this summer. And so for me, this whole campaign around brand messaging, I've been using as an opportunity to teach about branding, right? Because while visual branding is one component, and if you need visual branding, I'm happy to recommend some amazing designers. The other component is messaging, and messaging and visual branding work really closely together to position you as an expert, as a professional in your field. So what I did was I used the story of my visual branding done, and I talked a lot about, hey, here are the things that I was thinking about while I got my visual branding done, and here's how my messaging impacted it, and here are some of the things that I struggled with. Specifically, the email that just went out this week was about how I was really struggling before I got my branding to decide if I wanted my business to be two separate businesses, the Copy Studio and Copy Classroom, or two very closely related businesses that are under the same umbrella. And I actually hired a consultant to talk through this because it was just something that I could see both possibilities and I wasn't sure what direction to take it in. So all of this being said is I ran this whole campaign around the story of my visual branding, around the things that I'm thinking about, around my approach and my story, right? And if you look at all of my podcast episodes for that month and all of my emails for that month, they all relate back to this idea of messaging and visual branding being your foundation. And so after really talking about this, that is when I move on to sales. And it's not to say like, hey, I nurtured for 2 weeks and now I'm moving on to sales. Like, no, you're not going to be done nurturing, right? And now you're like a scammy salesman that is always talking about your offer and how you should buy now, buy now, buy now. No, you're still nurturing, you're still bringing value, but now you've spent some time positioning yourself, right? You've spent some time talking about your approach what kinds of things that you think about, and now you introduce your offer. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I see with this is really people just focusing on what's included, but not why it's included. And so really going into like, how does this help people get to where they want to go? What are the benefits, right? Like if you include calls, why do you include calls, right? How does that actually help people? And not just including deliverables to include deliverables, really being intentional about them and making sure that each piece that you include has a purpose and really shows why this offer, how is it going to help them? And then you can add in emails that, tell stories, that answer some commonly asked questions, that take you behind the scenes. There's so much you can do and offer your people while you're selling without necessarily just selling, right? So really thinking about, hey, what is that nurture piece? How can I carry this thread through? And what is the story that I'm telling? And how does this story relate to my offer? So another thing to consider is sustainability, right? Because making a campaign, it can be a lot of work, right? Like, especially if you're not really sure on your messaging, if it's one of the first few times you're running a campaign, it can feel really big. So I would say one thing to consider is you don't have to recreate offers every time you build a campaign. Like if you have an offer, you can run the same campaign 4 times in a year and really just update the messaging based on what you learned the last time. You can, change the lens a little bit. Maybe you have a new story. Maybe you have a one-on-one consulting offer, and this month you're focusing on onboarding. Next month you're focusing on offboarding, but the offer stays the same, right? You're just changing the lens of how you're looking at selling the offer, right? Maybe the offer is like, hey, you have a 60-minute call and then you get an action workbook, and you can change the focus every single month. You can repurpose your content, you can rotate it, but really thinking about how does this all tie back to the big promise that you thought about at the beginning. That's like really your check to make sure like this is intentional and strategic. Does this post relate back to that original story? Is this intentional? And it's not to say like if you have something you really want to talk about, you can send that email. Like if it's not related, you can still build those trusting connections. Like I said, there are no rules. Like this is just a framework that you can use so that you don't burn out, so that your content has a purpose, but you can also have fun with it, right? You can also be creative with it. So really thinking about what's going to work for you. All of this being said, your marketing campaigns don't have to be these huge launches. They can be really simple, and their purpose is to get the right people inside your offer. And so you don't really need to post 250 posts on Instagram. I know that's an exaggeration, but really you just need a message and an overarching story that is going to resonate with your people. So next time, I'm going to walk you through what my rest of the year looks like and how I'm thinking about it. And if you want some help, join the email list to learn how you can get more support with your messaging and your marketing campaigns. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time. That's a wrap on today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to rate and leave a review on your preferred listening platform. If you haven't, make sure you subscribe for weekly episodes about how to make money and work with the dreamiest of clients without having to get dressed in the morning. Make sure to check out the show notes down below, and I'll see you in the next episode.